The absolute power of kings. Imagine that you lived in a country where the laws were made by just one person, a king or a queen. That person could do almost anything he or she wanted. If a king wanted to go to war with another country, he could. Furthermore, he could raise taxes to pay for it. If someone upset him, he could just have them killed. Everyone in his country would have to do whatever he told them to because he had power over them all. That is what life was like in Europe in the Middle Ages, about 500 to 1,000 years ago. There were good kings and bad kings. There were also good queens and bad queens. Some leaders had a council of wise men to help them make decisions. Others did not, but they could all do as they pleased. The power of the Pope. Even more powerful than a king or queen was the Pope. He is the leader of the Roman Catholic Church. In the Middle Ages, most Western Europeans were Catholic. The Pope had authority over a lot of people, even kings and queens. A king made laws for the people in his own country, but the Pope made decisions that affected everyone. If someone did not obey him, he could punish that person. He could excommunicate or exclude them from the church. If a king did not obey the Pope could put the whole country under an interdict. This meant that all the churches in the country would be closed until the Pope said they could be opened again. In the Middle Ages, religion was an important part of life. People believed that if they did not have the blessing of the church when they died, they would go to hell. In hell, they would suffer terrible pain forever. No one wanted to suffer forever, so no one wanted to be excluded from the church. People wanted to be able to pray and confess their sins. They wanted to be pardoned for their sins. Most important of all, people wanted to go to a wonderful place called heaven when they died. So, although the Pope did not have an army, the punishments he could give were very scary. They lasted forever. The Battle of the Bishops. The Pope believed he should have ultimate control over everyone. After all, who could argue with someone who was getting their orders straight from God? But the kings objected to his interference in their kingdoms. One of the things popes and kings argued about was who should appoint bishops. A bishop is an important person in charge of a big area called a diocese, and all the churches and priests within it. In 1076, Henry IV, a German king who held the office of the Holy Roman Emperor, argued with Pope Gregory VII over who should appoint clergy. Henry was angry and called a meeting with the German bishops. He got them to declare that Gregory was no longer pope, so the Pope excommunicated or banned Henry from the church. This started a bitter struggle between them. In 1077, Henry was allowed to return to the church, but 3 years later he was excommunicated again. In 1084, Henry invaded Italy and set up a rival pope. Gregory died in exile a year later. Electing a pope. When a pope dies, a new pope is elected from the most important church officials. The church in those days was corrupt. Quite often, the leaders of the church would take bribes or give in to pressure to vote in a particular way. So it could be easy for a king to get the pope that he wanted. This is what happened in 14th century France. French domination of the Pope. The Pope usually lives in the Vatican, in Italy, but this was not always so. In 1286, the King of France, Philip IV, needed more money to finance his debts. Against Pope Boniface VIII's orders, he tried to get the churches in his country to pay him taxes. In 1303, Boniface planned to excommunicate Philip, but Philip had Boniface kidnapped before that happened. Boniface was held for 2 days and probably mistreated. He died a month later. The next pope, Benedict XI, only lasted a year. He was probably poisoned. In 1305, Philip got a French pope elected, Clement V, who moved the papal court to France. After that, the next 7 popes, all Frenchmen, lived in France, where they came under the control of the French kings at that time. Papal Indulgences. Over the years, there were many popes who abused their power, just like many kings did. One such pope in the 16th century was Pope Leo X, who sold papal indulgences. If someone had done something bad and they wanted to be forgiven, they could buy an indulgence from the church. This meant they could buy God's forgiveness for their sin and have a better chance of getting into heaven. Indulgences had been around for centuries, but under Leo X they led to problems. They started a movement that would change the Catholic Church forever. Pope Leo's actions made people question the teachings of the Church. In Germany, in 1517, a priest called Martin Luther objected to the selling of indulgences. He said you could not buy forgiveness. The Pope excommunicated him, but Luther carried on protesting. Others began to listen to him. Because of these events, a new form of Christianity developed. Its followers were called Protestants. The movement swept across Europe. It was called the Reformation because they wanted to reform the Catholic Church. Henry VIII of England. At the time of the Reformation, Henry VIII was King of England. He was married to a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon. They were married for 23 years. They had one daughter, but no sons. Henry wanted a son who could be king after he died, but Catherine was too old to have more children. Henry wanted to leave her. He also started looking for a younger wife who could have children. In those days, a king could not just throw out a wife. Kings and queens were married for life. Henry sent a letter asking the Pope for an annulment, but the Pope said no. Meanwhile, Henry decided that he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. In 1533, Henry married Anne in a secret ceremony. She was already pregnant with his baby. Henry was excommunicated by the Pope. In response, Henry made himself the head of the Church of England. Although Henry never became a Protestant himself, this act set England on the path to become mostly Protestant later. It also brought some wealth to England. Church land was sold off, over 800 monasteries were closed, and church treasures were taken for England. The world today. The Reformation weakened the position of the popes from that time and into the present. The power of kings also grew weaker around the same time. Kings who did not listen to their people did not last long. Charles I of England tried to rule without the support of his people, and eventually he was killed. Today, most Western countries are ruled by governments elected by the citizens. A few countries still have kings and queens, but they do not make laws or tell people what to do anymore. The Roman Catholic Church is still ruled by a pope who has absolute power over his followers. These days, however, he concerns himself only with religious matters. He does not get involved in politics. The Pope still has over 1 billion followers. He is one of the most respected people in the world.